My name is Donald Fisher. I'm the acting principal here at Green. I'm delighted to welcome you all on this really great afternoon. Probably many of you already heard that we have a cause for celebration, that our keynote speaker, Justice Murray Sinclair, was appointed to the Senate this morning. And as Mary said over lunch, he saved the timing of this, the announcement, for today, of course. First, let me recognize that we are on the unceded and traditional territory of the Musqueam Nation, and we're grateful for that privilege, as we always are, particularly in this surrounding. For those of you that are unaware or haven't visited the college before, let me just say a few words about it. We're a residential community of about 100, including graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and a small number of faculty. The themes for our college from the beginning, and we're just over 20 years old, so we're a very new institution, the themes that tie our community together are interdisciplinarity, ideas, and friendship. And there's a strong focus, as you might expect, given today, on issues of social justice. The college is grateful then for the co-sponsorship of the UBC Centennial Committee, the Hewitt Bostock Endowment, the Faculties of Art, Arts, Education and Law. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Link Kessler, who is the Director of the First Nations House of Learning here on campus and a co-organizer of this event. Link, please.
Is this microphone working? Yes? Oh, great. Metakayapi oyasin chante washte and apechiushapolo. My relatives, it's my pleasure to greet you here today. And I really only have one function in this part of this event today, which is to introduce one of the two most handsome men I've ever met. I'll let you figure out who the other one is. He's also in the room. Kayapalano from Musqueam, Howard Grant. And I invite him to come up and say a few words.
No, I didn't tell him to say that. Justice Sinclair did, so. But first of all, I'm deeply honored today and most humbled because to say a few words in front of a very distinguished audience. And I feel like a child again in sitting at the floor of our old people and to say, what am I going to learn? So I just thought I would introduce that as a first item. But on behalf of my Musqueam people and my family, first of all, I just want to thank the university for continuing to recognize that this is the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam people. And that today, that our most distinguished guest and all of you, I welcome you to this most beautiful place on earth called Musqueam territory. I want you to know that my name is Kayapolano, and he was the son of Holchimiltuch, and it was Kayapolano, the great warrior, the great war chief, that met Captain Vancouver and Captain Narvaez prior to that as they arrived upon these shores. And it was here that they first spotted that vessel arriving on these shores. And it was here that our old people taught our younger children in regards to the way of life. It was here where our families mourned the loss of our people. And in today's conversation, we mourn the loss of the ones that were taken away from us for many, many years. And I know today that we're going to learn a bit more in how to start that healing process. But I want you to know from a personal perspective of my own. I didn't go to residential school, but I had the unfortunate reality of listening and watching an auntie cry and tell a story. I listened to my uncles and watched them have teary eyes as they tried to tell their stories to someone for them to remember. I had to remember being lonely as a child, not going to that residential school, being left alone. And then upon the return of that child, I felt a bitterness because they were somewhat jealous to say that how was I so fortunate to have their parents and hearing those stories. And then as time passed, I again felt those same emotional issues because I saw my aunties cry once more time because of the loss of that child, because that child not knowing how to deal with that emotional effect that residential schools had on them. I had to take them down from the limbs of a tree. Those tears will always be there. And then remembering to carry them to their final resting place. And once again, hearing my aunties cry and seeing my uncles with teary eyes. So those are lessons that how do we get across to our fellow man to help us heal and carry on that journey. And last but not least, how do I talk to those survivors to say your dad did love you and your mom really loved you. And I look forward to the conversation that our honorable guest, Justice Murray Sinclair, is going to give to you today. And I welcome him to our territory, and I raise my hands to him to say he's done a wonderful job to communicate to the general public about the hurt and the need for reconciliation, and to not just say we're sorry, but to do something about it. So on behalf of Musqueam people, and more particularly my family and myself, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Howard, for those inspirational words. I'm Martha Piper. I'm the interim president and vice chancellor of the University of British Columbia. And I am deeply honored to have been invited today to introduce your guest speaker, Justice Murray Sinclair. Doubly honored, indeed, to introduce him on the day of the announcement that he has been appointed to the Canadian Senate. It is truly an honor to have you with us today. Mr. Justice Murray Sinclair does not really need an introduction. Despite being by birth and education a Manitoban through and through, he is a national figure, known and respected right across this country for his work on behalf of the alienated and dispossessed, and for his championing the rights of our Aboriginal citizens. Canadians have learned in recent months some of the elements of our history that have been repressed or conveniently forgotten. The shameful treatment of our First Nations people in the name of assimilation and appropriation. The forced education of First Nations children at residential schools, and the abuses that often accompanied it. The attempted stifling of Indigenous language and culture. All of these matters, though long known to some, have been finally brought into the open and given wide circulation by the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission chaired by Justice Sinclair, whose work was completed last December. Justice Sinclair has been rightly praised for his handling of the Commission and its report, and for the way in which he combined clarity of wisdom and compassion in presenting the Commission's findings. But even as we praise the report, we should remember that Justice Sinclair has fought for the rights of Indigenous people throughout his entire career. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was simply the culmination of many other efforts in pursuit of social justice. As Manitoba's first Aboriginal judge, he dedicated himself to improving the lives of Canada's First Nations, notably in the report of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry of Manitoba in 1999, which showed in telling detail the ways in which Canada's laws and social system were failing its Native citizens. Justice Sinclair's later work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission may have more public impact because of its greater scope, but at every point in his career, he has brought the cause of Aboriginal rights to the forefront and fought to bring public attention to the need for action. Here at UBC, in large part because of where we are situated, we are fortunate to have built a strong relationship with our Aboriginal neighbors on whose unceded territory this university stands. British Columbia's first Aboriginal judge, Alfred Scow, was a UBC alum. Our education faculty has long and successful tradition of preparing Aboriginal educators. The First Nations House of Learning is a testament to the university's wish to nurture Indigenous languages and traditions, including music and the visual arts. And UBC is also the home to one of the world's leading collections of Indigenous art in our magnificent Museum of Anthropology. But important as such achievements have been and continue to be, we cannot stop to congratulate ourselves. We must take the words and actions of Aboriginal leaders like Murray Sinclair to heart. We must find ways to bridge the divide that still exists between Aboriginal peoples and the rest of Canada so that true healing and reconciliation can take place. To that end, UBC is planning the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center, where visitors will learn about the past, present, and future of Aboriginal experience in this country, and where people from all academic disciplines will converge and engage in advanced learning and research with Aboriginal scholars. Today's presentation by Justice Murray Sinclair will give us a foretaste of what we can all learn by looking frankly and honestly at some painful aspects of our past and using what we find there to create a better world for all Canadians in the future. I want to thank the Justice for being here with us this afternoon and welcome his family to our home. And I know you'll join me in welcoming Justice Murray Sinclair.
Bonjour, Nikanasituk, Nizanagijik, Indigenous, Kigododem. In my language, I greet you, I introduce myself, and begin by thanking the President for that wonderful introduction, and thanking Howard for that welcoming to the territory of the Musqueam people. I truly appreciate the warmth with which we have been received, both by the university and by the people of this territory. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that all of you who are here in this room and others on campus have reached out generously today as well. Today has been an interesting day for me. My phone really hasn't stopped ringing since about 5 o'clock. People in the East forget that you're in a different time zone. And as a result, the number of phone calls has been quite extraordinary. One of the questions I had today, incidentally, relates to the introduction that you've heard. It has to do with whether or not people will still call me Justice Sinclair or not. I hadn't actually thought about it until I was asked, but it reminded me of a story that Clara Hughes, who's one of our honorary witnesses at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, told me when she was introducing me to her mother. Her mother told me that she has a little club of people in her neighborhood who have coffee every once in a while, and one of the mothers in that club had listened to me on the radio doing an interview. And so she was so impressed that she told her daughter all about it, and her daughter listened to the interview on a podcast. And her daughter, who was pregnant, decided when she gave birth to her son that she was going to name her son after me. So as a result, his name is Justice. So, in keeping with that fine tradition, I think in order to avoid confusion, I'm going to legally change my name to Justice Murray Sinclair. I love introductions, incidentally. I love hearing them, and they're particularly humbling often to hear them. But I never forget the fact that you always have to be centered after you've heard a very warm introduction to be able to get back to what it is that you're trying to achieve. And the most centering introduction I received was one at a gathering of survivors in Saskatchewan, where I was being welcomed by a room of about 300 or 400 survivors who were there to listen to what I had to say. But they were a rowdy bunch. Saskatchewan Crees are like that. Where's the Cree guy? Saskatchewan Crees are like that. Very rowdy. They wouldn't settle down. And so the survivor who was chairing the event finally got up to the microphone, tried numerous times to get everybody to settle down, and they wouldn't. And so he said, in 7 words, this introduction: shut up, sit down, here he is. Worked for me. So, went right into my presentation from that. Being present on the campus of the University of British Columbia is very special to me. I've been here a number of times. And Judge Alfred Scow, who's a good friend of mine, was in fact one of the first people I called when I was asked to become a judge back in 1988. I initially had been called by the government on 2 or 3 different occasions and turned down the request to become a judge because I thought it would be a boring job, actually. Didn't turn out that way, but so I turned it down, and then finally I got a visit one day from Phil Fontaine, Elijah Harper, Eric Robinson, and a number of other chiefs who came to see me to convince me that it was something that they felt was important for the Indigenous population of Manitoba to have an Aboriginal person on the bench. And so I consulted with my family, with my colleagues and others who said, if you don't like it, you can always go back to practicing law. I loved practicing law. I loved being a lawyer. I loved being in court. I loved arguing cases. I loved representing people. And I didn't want to give that up. In addition to that, I was making more money than judges were ever making and ever going to make. So I didn't really want to look into deflecting myself from what I saw my career path being. But they persuaded me that I should reconsider. So one of the people I called was Alfie Scal. And I called Alfie and I said, because he was the only Aboriginal judge in Canada at the time, and I said, I'd like to talk to you about this decision I have to make, and tell me what you think. And he said, I'm going to come and see you. And he did. He and his wife came to visit us, Catherine and I, and spent an evening with us to talk about what it was like for him to be a judge, an Aboriginal person who was appointed to a court which was the representation of a whole system of oppression for Indigenous people. And he warned me about some of the things that he had faced and what I would face as well. And he told me how he handled them, and he told me what to expect, but he also told me about the importance of it. And he told me about the importance of public service generally, but also the importance for our young people to have role models and other individuals to whom they could look up and who would be able to show the way for them, who would be able to give them a sense of a path into the future that would give them more than hope, but true ambition. And so we had a very good and meaningful conversation. So with that, I accepted his advice and took the step that I did, fully expecting that within a very short period of time I'd step down and go back to practicing law, which is what I'd love to do. I was sworn in as a judge on March the 3rd of 1988, and 4 days later, March the 7th of 1988, a young Indigenous leader in Manitoba by the name of J.J. Harper was shot and killed by a police officer. And then on March the 8th, the next day, the government of Manitoba was defeated and they voted non-confidence in the legislature, and an election was called. And by Friday of that week, the government had announced that they were going to order an inquiry into the shooting death of J.J. Harper, and they asked me if I would be one of the commissioners. And they also asked if I would take on the role of looking into the death and the murder of Helen Betty Osborne at the same time. And the rest, as they say, is history. It's now come down to this, where all of that work, all of that public work, now has culminated in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and led to the decision that I had to make today about moving on to something else so that I was no longer unemployed in the eyes of my wife. But the other connection, of course, to the University of British Columbia, is that my son received his PhD here, and our daughter's partner, Amanda, is going to law school here, and it gives us a good connection to Vancouver and to British Columbia to be able to come out here from time to time and see them. So it was just natural to accept the invitation to come and talk to you. And I thank you very much for the invitation to be able to present my thoughts about why the calls to action that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued were so important. I want to begin by acknowledging that the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not mine alone, of course. I had colleagues, Dr. Marie Wilson and Chief Wilton Littlechild, who accompanied me throughout the entire work of the commission and worked with all of us to develop the calls to action that were put in place so that we were able to not only educate the public, but to give a sense of direction to the public into the future about what it is that needed to be done to ensure that the path to reconciliation was clear as we were going forward. Does anybody have any Kleenex? Thank you. Thanks. So on their behalf as well, I want to express our appreciation to the University of British Columbia and to all of you who are here for the interest in the work that we have undertaken and upon which we've reported, and for this opportunity for you to be able to hear why the Commission said what it said. I don't plan on spending a lot of time talking about the work that we did in terms of the detail and what it was that we did. I just wanted to encourage you all to become familiar as much as you can with the work of the Commission in terms of the interim report that we issued called They Came for the Children in 2012, which was a historical summary of the evidence as we had developed it to that point in time, as well as the summary of the final report, which we issued in June of last year, which contains all of the calls to action and a summary of our findings and explanation of what it was that we were thinking when we issued those calls to action. And also, of course, the final report, which is about 5,000 pages long, so it might be a little excessive for some of you. But at the same time, I think it provides all of us, with a good foundation of understanding what the story of residential schools is all about in this province and throughout the country as well. So I'd like to discuss the background of those calls to action and give you some understanding of why we said what we did. Now you have to keep in mind that the TRC came out of the settlement of the largest class action lawsuit in the history of Canada, where upwards of some 60,000 individuals had filed claims against the Government of Canada and the churches that were involved in the operation of residential schools. The Commission itself was created by the settlement agreement in 2000, which was reached in 2007. And the settlement agreement involved the signatures of several parties, including the Government of Canada, the Catholic and several Protestant churches, and the survivors themselves, as represented by the Assembly of First Nations and Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. The Métis, who had attended residential schools, were represented throughout the proceedings with the consent of the Métis National Council by the Assembly of First Nations, but only for those who attended those schools that were listed in the settlement agreement. Now you need to keep in mind as well that not all schools that were attended by Aboriginal people in Canada were listed in the settlement agreement, largely because during the negotiations around the agreement, it appears that the Government of Canada only agreed to list in the agreement those schools that it had a direct role in managing. And those schools that were managed by other entities, such as churches and provincial governments or private entities, were not listed in the settlement agreement, even when it was very clear that the government would have ordered children to attend those particular schools. Many of those schools were not listed. Only about 140 schools ended up being listed in the settlement agreement, and several hundred others were listed in the claims made by other survivors who attended other schools that they wanted to include in the claim, but because, as the government said, they were not directly involved in managing those other schools, they would not agree to those claims being heard. There was a provision in the settlement agreement for schools to be added. The initial request to add a school had to be submitted to the Government of Canada, and such requests had to be supported by evidence in the government's view that they were in fact managing the school. Altogether, there was a request to add over 1,300 other schools to the settlement agreement, all of which were denied by the government. The government refused almost all such requests, but there was a process in place by which that decision could be appealed. One could appeal the decision to the National Administration Committee, which oversaw the agreement, and it had representation from the churches, from Canada, and from survivors as well. But the National Administration Committee's hands were tied somewhat by a provision in the agreement which said that it could not render a decision that would require Canada to spend additional money for the agreement unless Canada approved the decision. So, in other words, Canada had a veto power over decisions of the National Administration Committee, which created additional spending. In that way, the committee turned down almost all the appeals that were rendered to it to add schools to the committee. There was a right to go to court to ask the courts to rule on adding schools to the agreement, but of course, the process of doing so was a complicated one. You had to hire lawyers. It was time-consuming. It was costly. Few such applications were ever made, and in only one case were 2 schools added to the settlement agreement, those being schools in southern Ontario. Now, all of that is just meant to give you some background about why there are so many people out there today who went to a residential school, often with the direction or at the direction of the government, but who are not able to make claims under the settlement agreement. The commission was not a government-created commission. The Government of Canada often claimed credit for setting up the commission, but in reality, the commission's existence came about solely because of the government. It was always intended that the commission would be independent from the government and from the other parties to the settlement agreement, and that was a very clear sticking point at the outset. While the TRC did report to the parties, it was subject only to the supervision of the courts. Students who attended residential schools but did not reside there, often referred to as day school students or day scholars or day students, were not eligible to claim for the first of 2 levels of compensation under the agreement, known as the Common Experience Payment. And this was so even though while in the schools, they were clearly subjected to the same level of cultural assimilation and cultural genocide that we found occurred within the schools, and the fact that they were treated the same as all of those who were actual residents of the schools. Métis children who attended schools that were run by churches or were by provincial schools were totally left out of the agreement. This has created, as I said, a significant class of former students who are excluded from the agreement and its compensation processes, although we as a commission tried to include them in the work that we did in offering them an opportunity to speak publicly, which many of them did. But as a commission, we took the view that to be effective, any process of reconciliation was going to have to address this very significant gap in the treatment of Indigenous people who still felt aggrieved by their having to attend residential schools and by being excluded from the settlement agreement. As a result, in our view, and we express this in our report, the road to reconciliation is not going to be easy because there are so many Aboriginal people who continue to feel similarly aggrieved to those who are covered by the agreement when have their grievances ignored. Now, while I say that the settlement agreement in fact created the commission, I mean that it exists because the survivors negotiated for it. They agreed to set aside $60 million of compensation money for the purposes of the work of the commission. And that money, if it had not been set aside for the commission, would have gone to provide for additional compensation for additional survivors. The mandate that the commission was originally given in 2008 was for 5 years, but as you recall, the first set of commissioners quit after a short period of time. We were asked to resume the commission in 2009, and our mandate was to end in 2014. But after a series of extensions due primarily to the difficulties we encountered in getting documents out of the hands of government as they were legally obligated to provide them to us, our mandate officially ended on December the 31st of 2015. The timeline for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was obviously an unreasonable timeline when it came to the whole question of reconciliation. But we have to keep in mind that time was of the essence insofar as reconciliation was concerned because of the average age of survivors at the time that the settlement agreement was negotiated, which was well into the 60s. In addition to that, while we knew that reconciliation would not be achieved within 5 years, we took the approach that our role was really to identify what reconciliation meant and what it would take. And in the context of those times, what the parties, including Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, needed to do in order to get to a process of reconciliation. The Commission itself, of course, had two obligations. In addition to reconciliation, the primary obligation was to reveal the true story of residential schools as much as possible. And the second obligation was to inspire a process for reconciliation, but also to give guidance to what that process was going to be like. The Commission was very clearly primarily about the education of children. And as a result, we were directed not only to investigate the federal government's educational system for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children that had been in place for 125 years, we were also called upon to consider the whole question of the education of Indigenous children generally. Education was also an implied part of our mandate when it came to what it was that we were to reveal to Canadians in our report, and we took the view that it would not be sufficient if we simply waited till the end of the report in order to reveal to the public what it was that we had learned, but that the education of Canadians should occur throughout the process of the Commission. And so as a result, we engaged in some very public event processes. The story of the schools obviously is a lesson in education, and it's for that reason that we conclude as well that education really holds the key for reconciliation in the future. In our report, we state that education itself is important to all societies. In order for any society to function properly and to its full capacity, it must raise and educate its children so that they can know ultimately where they belong. They learn about that by answering what philosophers such as Socrates and Plato and our own elders call the great questions of life. And those questions are, where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I? In order to know where you come from, children need to know their personal story. And that's why children are curious about how did I get into mommy's tummy? But in addition to that, children need to know about their history prior to their birth. They need to know the stories of their parents and of their grandparents, of their direct and indirect ancestors. They need to know the stories of their real and mythological heroes and villains. And they also need to know how those heroes and villains manifest themselves in the present. As part of that story, we also need to know about the story of the community of people to whom we are attached, our collective story, all the way back to our place in the creation of this world and of this universe. We all have a creation story, and as my elder, Edward Benton Benet, has said, everyone's creation story is true. We have to respect that. We also need to learn that not all creation stories are the same, and the importance of their being different but true is an important teaching about respect. In addition to knowing where we came from, we also need to know where we are going. It's a natural outcome of knowing where you come from, of course, but knowing where you're going is not just about where you're going to be next year or next week or even in 25 years. It's about having a future that you can believe in and that you can aspire to. And it's about how you can attain it. It's also about what happens to us when we die. It's about the spirit world and life after death, and a reaffirmation of the role the Creator has in maintaining matters of life and death. It's about belief, it's about faith, and it's about hope. The third question of knowing why you are here is also related to those first two questions. Knowing one's creation story is always imbued with teachings about why the Creator made this creation to begin with, and what our place within it as human beings is and was intended to be. But the answer to that question is also about knowing what role you play in the overall collective. It's about knowing your family, knowing about your clan's role in society, and taking pride in belonging to it. It's about knowing whether your purpose is fulfilled through being an artist, through being a warrior, a leader, a caregiver, or a healer, or a helper to others. Clan teachings and naming ceremonies in my culture provide answers about that. But the answer to that question is also influenced by knowing what your family and your community need, and then filling that need and feeling the satisfaction that derives from it. The fourth question, who am I, is the most important, because it is one that we are always asking and we are always answering. It is the constant question. It is influenced by everything and by everyone. We fight to maintain the answers that we like, and we fight to change and to improve the answers that we don't like. We strive to attain the perfect answer by the time we die, not realizing that, in fact, there is no right or wrong or perfect answer. It is a question about understanding our life. It is about identity. It is about what you have become, but it is also about what you want to become. That is why it is constant. In many ways, the answer to that question derives from knowing the answers to the other three questions. If one of them is unanswered, or its answer is in doubt, then this question, who am I, remains unfulfilled, and your life is and remains out of balance. For children in residential schools, those questions all went unfulfilled. The answers that they were forced to accept ran counter to much of the knowledge that they already carried from the moment of their conception and their birth. The schools were about changing their identities as they knew them. But how can one do that when there is already so much information that you carry that it's not consistent with the identity that you are being told you must take on? The potential for internal conflict within those who were taken away and placed in residential schools was enormous. And that potential was never recognized by those who ran the schools. Our own elders and philosophers were well aware of it. I was at a youth elder conference years ago when I heard a young man say, "It's hard being an Indian," he said. But an elder who was also a residential school survivor responded by saying, "It's harder not being one when you know you are." But that only explains the Aboriginal side of the issue. There is the non-Aboriginal side as well. Not only have Aboriginal people been educated in this country in a manner that has caused them confusion about who they are, but non-Aboriginal people have also been educated in a manner that has caused them confusion about us as well. Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, said this in 1883, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. And though he may learn to read and write, His habits and training mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself, he said, as head of the department, that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. This statement was given in the House of Commons in the Parliament of Canada in 1883, 13 years after the treaty-making process in which the government promised to build schools on First Nations land had been made to the thousands of Indigenous people in the West. This view that Indigenous people were savages and inferior people has been a common one held over the years and taught to many, as you will see. But it has been a debilitating one as well, and it's had a debilitating effect not only upon our human relationships, but also upon our public policy in this country. As commissioners, we were governed in our approach to reconciliation with this thought, that the way that we have all been educated in this country, Aboriginal children in residential schools, and Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children in public and other schools, is the reason why we are at the state that we are today, to a point where the psychological and emotional well-being of Aboriginal children has been greatly harmed, and the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people has been seriously damaged and is in need of repair. This is so, not just in terms of what was taught or not taught about residential schools, but also in terms of what Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students have been taught about each other. Education has brought us to the current state of poor relations between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country, but education holds the key to making things better. We know that making things better will not be done overnight. It will take generations. It will take concerted effort over a number of generations to fix it. That's how the damage was created, and that's how the damage will be repaired. Reconciliation should not be seen as needing to heal Indigenous people. Reconciliation needs to be seen as needing to heal this country. If we do not, then the same type of treatment will continue in other elements of our government's approach. Aboriginal children will continue to grow up confused about their identity and about their responsibilities. They will grow up angry at a society that continues to deny them that, and non-Aboriginal people will continue to be educated to believe in the inferiority of Aboriginal people and the inherent superiority of non-Aboriginal societies and cultures. Our internal conflicts will continue, and Canada's potential as a nation will never be met. If we agree on the objective of reconciliation and agree to work together, the work that we do today will immeasurably strengthen the social fabric of Canada tomorrow. Even in an era of fiscal restraint, when spending more money faces constant challenges, much of what we need to do can be accomplished. It starts with examining what we are doing now with what we have. I'm sure you've heard many stories about the horrific abuse some have experienced at the hands of those who ran the schools. The stories of abuse have dominated the conversation about residential schools to this point, but it is not the complete story. Most children who attended residential schools were in fact not physically or sexually abused in the schools. Statistics bear that out. Of the 80,000 claimants for common experience payments paid for under the settlement agreement for merely attending the schools, it is anticipated that between 25 and 30,000 are likely to file and receive compensation for claims of serious injury arising from an act of abuse. However, that does not mean that not all were traumatized. Though not all were abused, all of the children who went to the schools have been damaged in some way, even without realizing it. Physical and sexual abuse are not the only source of trauma. The separation from parents at such a young age caused dissociative behavior and a lack of affection on their part. Being subjected to a constant climate of fear, of loneliness, of hostility, and of oppression does something to your psyche that only those who have experienced it can understand and explain. But those alone, as serious as they are, would have been enough to cause enormous personal damage to the children, especially when combined with the children's long-term institutionalization and the isolation they experienced from their family, in addition to the physical and sexual abuse that did occur. Such matters of separation dominate the testimony of survivors when they discuss the schools with us. Even in the stories that we had heard at the Commission about how some survivors feel that the schools took them from home environments that were violent and neglectful and impoverished and gave them opportunities they would never have otherwise had, we must always keep in mind that we are talking about home environments that have largely been created by the legacy of residential schools. The past several generations of survivors were invariably intergenerational survivors themselves of parents who went to the schools. The child welfare system of this country claims to be saving children, but it does not acknowledge that the governments that created the child welfare system that is supposedly saving our children also help to destroy the families from which the children are being removed. From an Aboriginal perspective, it is hard and illogical to give the government any credit for saving children when it has in fact been the main perpetrator of the past. Residential schools have closed now and are no longer in operation, and that has been so for at least one generation. In fact, Canada's Indian residential schools had pretty much closed by the 1980s. But I want to assure you, if it isn't already obvious, that the legacy of those schools is very much alive with us today. In one of the presentations made to us by Chief Reginald Crowfoot in Alberta, he says, "You may think that you are through with the past, but the past is never truly through with you." It lives on in the daily experiences of the survivors in this country who attended the schools. It lives on in their attitudes about themselves and in the opportunities that are and are not open to them. It lives on in their children who do not know their languages or their cultures and who may never have learned to parent properly because they were denied the chance to observe and receive positive parenting from their own parents, or to participate in any way in any kind of normal family life, and lives on in the lives of the children of those children. It also lives on in the attitudes and the ignorance of Canadians of my generation, and other generations as well, who have received the accepted teachings and prejudices of the past. A great accumulation of damage has been done to Aboriginal cultures, languages, families, and communities. A great deal of damage has also been done to the relationship between Aboriginal people and all other Canadians because non-Aboriginal people have been educated not to respect Aboriginal people and their cultures and their communities. Sadly, the effect has also been that in our public schools, Aboriginal children have also been taught about this country, about themselves, and about their place in the world in a manner which has caused them shame and humiliation. If you do not believe this, then you do not understand the implications of the continuing high dropout rates of Aboriginal children in the public schools of this country. Part of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did, as you know, was to travel across Canada to listen to the public statements of residential school survivors and their children, the intergenerational survivors as we have come to call them. Our intent was to tell a balanced story, so therefore we also heard from many who worked within the schools. Some of the statements we heard from the survivors and from those who worked there were very, very moving. And these were public events that we held, of course, and the public, at least a certain portion of the public, was not only interested in what was being said, but was riveted by the processes. We visited hundreds of communities, we heard thousands of statements, and in almost every community where non-Aboriginal persons have been in the audience, someone, sometimes several people, would come up to me and to the other commissioners and say, I didn't know any of this. I went to schools in this country. I attended schools and high schools in my province. I even went to university, they would say, and I wasn't taught any of this. I had my entire schooling and wasn't taught a thing about residential schools or the laws that were passed to maintain them. Most Canadians have been taught very little or nothing about the Indian residential school system, but they were probably taught something, one way or the other, about the history of Canada and the role of Indigenous peoples in that history. They were probably taught, for instance, that the history of Canada began, as it did with North America, in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You remember that little ditty from your school education? Or in Canada, we would have been taught that the nation that we are now well regarded to belong to started when John Cabot and Jacques Cartier landed on a small piece of land in the eastern part of this territory, planted a flag, and claimed it, the whole territory, right to this area, on behalf of European nations. Penny Clark of the University of British Columbia wrote about this and the representation of Aboriginal people in English-Canadian history textbooks in her work entitled Teaching the Violent Past, History, Education, and Reconciliation. Dr. Clark divides the treatment of Aboriginal peoples in textbooks prior to 1970 into 6 general categories. First of all, there's the category of Aboriginal people as spectator or bystander, basically irrelevant to the main narrative of the text and to the narrative of the history of this country. Next category is Aboriginal persons as savage warriors who were a danger lurking in the background of the settlers' story. Aboriginal people, she says, is the other category, as uniquely spiritual, almost mystical people, followers of those mystical beliefs, naive to the forces at play all around them, and victim of their own lack of awareness. The other categories, she says, are Aboriginal people as a problem to settlement, Aboriginal people as protester, and Aboriginal people as invisible. Nation building has been the main theme of Canada's history curricula for a long time, and Aboriginal people, except for a few notable exceptions trotted out as if to prove the rule, have been portrayed as bystanders, if not obstacles, to that enterprise of nation building. Dr. Ken Osborne, a former professor of education at the University of Manitoba, and his specialty is the teaching of history, wrote a book, or is writing a book, about the history of the teaching of history in Canada. And here's what he had to say when he shared his manuscript with us. In both English language and French language textbooks, he says, First Nations were typically assigned the textbook equivalent of a reserve, a segregated first chapter of a quasi-ethnographic nature in which they appeared to live in a timeless past that was now outdated and best forgotten. Before the 1970s, he says, textbooks overwhelmingly saw Canadian history as beginning with the arrival of Europeans in North America. And with the arrival of Europeans, the First Nations made an occasional cameo appearance in the early history of New France, in the context of the fur trade, no doubt. Briefly, they reappeared during the War of 1812, and finally, they reappeared as an obstacle to European settlement of the West in the Sir John A. Macdonald era. Totally lost in this description of Canadian history was any sense of Aboriginal culture as a successful adaptation to the physical environment, and of Aboriginal life as self-sustaining and self-sufficient in its own terms. He goes on to say, European people had religions. Aboriginal peoples were superstitious and had strange ideas about the world going on around them. Europeans held ceremonies. Aboriginal people indulged in orgies. Europeans had technology. Aboriginal people used crude inventions. Europeans had doctors. Aboriginal peoples had medicine men who worked their cures, quote, by beating drums, dancing, and howling, close quote. So why am I referring to academic research into the way Aboriginal people are represented in textbooks prior to the 1970s? Well, I have two reasons for talking about that. First of all, many of today's leading and prominent Canadians attended school and university in that era, long before the educational authorities began to take their first critical look at curricula as it relates to Aboriginal peoples. That education has influenced each and every one of us and each and every one of them. As an Aboriginal student, for example, it denied to me any sense of pride that I might have in my ancestors and their role in history of this part of the world. For my non-Aboriginal classmates, it taught them that we were wild and savage and uncivilized, and that given the conditions of Aboriginal people in modern society, we had not advanced very far from that stage. My non-Aboriginal classmates were taught to be proud of the accomplishments of their ancestors in taming this wild country and wresting it from the savages, in establishing the wonderful nation now known as Canada, part of that great, larger enterprise known as the British Empire, and to take pride in the advanced civilizations from which their ancestors came, even though the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes observed that the life of the English commoner of his day was, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. My education lacked relevance for me, and this was so despite my success at it. But that success came at a price. It taught me and others that my people were irrelevant. By implication, it caused me to feel that I was too. It taught us to believe in the inferiority of Aboriginal people and in the inherent superiority of white European civilizations. And in order to get the grades that I did in public schools, I was compelled to repeat that unconscious mantra. The system of my day did not teach us to respect Aboriginal people because it never told us anything about the Aboriginal presence in this country that showed the humanity of the people. We were all educated to be the same, and if we rebelled, we were weeded out, or we weeded ourselves out. Of the Aboriginal students, for example, that I started grade school with, none other than myself ever graduated from high school. Even my brother and sister, who will both gladly tell you that they were smarter than me, did not graduate from high school. But though I and others succeeded in that system, it was not without cost to our own humanity. We have a long way to go in this country. The second reason why I need you to understand why that history and why I know that that history is important to know is because talking about those academics and the research that they have done shows that it's going to take us a long time and a great deal of concerted effort to turn around those damaging public attitudes. Because the leaders who have come from that system are not only have ingrained within their mindset those views about who Indigenous people are, but they are also ingrained in the philosophy of the practices, the protocols, and the legislation that exists in this country as well. Most people who see the dysfunction of Aboriginal communities have no idea how that dysfunction occurred, or what caused it, and how government has had a heavy hand in influencing it, in creating that reality through actions and policies such as the residential schools. In that environment, it becomes easy for political leaders and for members of Canadian society to blame Aboriginal people for their lot in life and for their failure to overcome it, as others have. I cannot tell you the number of times I have had a non-Indigenous person tell me that their mother and father came here from Europe with nothing and pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and now they are a successful human being. Why can't Indigenous people do the same? So I want to say something about the current state of education in Canada. Now, it has changed from the day that I attended school, there's no doubt of that. The real question is whether it's changed enough, and whether it's committed to changing enough. I'm aware that there have been genuine attempts to reform what our children, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, have been taught and are being taught about Aboriginal peoples in Canada, and even about the Indian residential school system itself. The Legacy of Hope Foundation and the Aboriginal Healing Foundation commissioned a study, for example, on an environmental scan of Canadian Curriculum Services Canada, of the curricula being used in our elementary schools, secondary schools, and post-secondary programs throughout the country in 2011. The purpose was to produce a comprehensive picture of how the topic of residential schools was being handled in provincial curricula across the country, and to identify opportunities for improvement. Their report reached several interesting conclusions. Firstly, they said the status of curriculum regarding Indian residential schools varied widely across the country, from recently revised to revisions that were in progress, to curriculum, in fact, that was several years old and quite ignorant of some very important topics and information. In much of the provincial and territorial curricula, they said content on residential schools is limited, and if presented, is often a subset of a broader context. Now, I don't ever want to dismiss the broad context. The broad context is very important. It's obviously very crucial, in fact, as we go forward. All students, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, need to learn what the history of this country is all about, and that it did not, in fact, begin in 1492, or even with the arrival of Vikings much earlier than that. They need to learn about the Aboriginal nations that the Europeans met, about their rich linguistic and cultural heritage, about what they felt and what they thought as they dealt with such historic figures as Champlain, La Vérendrye, and the representatives of the Hudson's Bay Company, with just a few examples. They need to learn why they negotiated treaties, and that they negotiated them with purpose and integrity and in good faith. They need to learn why Aboriginal leaders and elders fight so hard to defend those poorly worded treaties and what they represent to them, and why they have been ignored by Euro-Canadian settlers and governments. They need to learn about what it means to have inherent rights, what those rights are for Aboriginal people, and the settler government's obligations in those areas where treaties have never been negotiated in the first place. They need to learn of the many issues that are ongoing and why. They need to learn, for example, that the doctrine of discovery, the politically and socially accepted basis for European claims to the land and riches of this country, has never been accepted in its entirety in Canadian courts, and has now been repudiated throughout the world, recently by the United Nations and the World Council of Churches. But this is not enough. As I said before, mainstream Canadians see the dysfunction of Aboriginal communities, but they have no idea how that happened, what caused it, or how government contributed to that reality through residential schools, and the policies and laws that were in place during their existence. Our education system, through omission or commission, has failed to do that, and misunderstanding, ignorance, and racism has resulted. Shame, humiliation, a lack of self-respect, and anger has also occurred on the part of Indigenous children coming out of that system. The educational systems of this country bear a large share of the responsibility for the current state of affairs, but it can fix what it has broken. What our education systems need to do is this: it must commit to teach Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children, our children and our grandchildren, how to speak respectfully to and about each other in the future. It begins with teaching them the truth about this country and our history. Knowing what happened will lead to better understanding. Understanding will lead to respect. And reconciliation is all about respect. The relationship must be founded on mutual respect, but we must not lose sight of the threshold importance of ensuring that, firstly, Aboriginal people are given an opportunity to develop their own self-respect. That must come first. Thank you.
So we're taking a break now for 15-20 minutes. Please enjoy the tea and coffee. Your seats. We're moving into the second part of the program, and as you know from the program on your seats, we have 4 panelists that are going to respond to Justice Sinclair's talk and then give their own response to the recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. We're delighted to have 4 relatively new scholars coming across the faculties of law, education, medicine, and arts. The way we'll proceed is as follows. Link is going to moderate the session. He will invite each speaker up, each respondent up in turn. As they've given their 12 minutes or so, they'll sit here on the dais, and once they've all finished, we'll invite Murray to come back and then have a discussion with you and all the 5 participants. So thank you. Link.
Well, welcome back, everyone. And actually, my role in the festivities here is going to be remarkably simple. I will invite our panelists to come up and speak, and I will ruthlessly hold them to their 12 minutes so that there's a really good opportunity to hear some comments by Justice Sinclair following their talks, perhaps, and your comments and discussion as well. So I will have plenty of time for that because I know all of these speakers are incredibly disciplined people who stick within the allotted time. Your programs contain biographies of our panelists, and they were it's clear that someone spent some time on them and I think listed the incredible accomplishments of each of our speakers. So I am not going to do that. I'm just going to invite them up to speak with very brief introductions. And our first speaker will be Dr. Nadine Caron, who I've had the pleasure of working with quite a bit. She's a surgeon in the Northern Medical Program in Prince George and a co-director of the UBC Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. And Nadine, it's a pleasure to welcome you here to speak today.
Good afternoon. Got my Kleenex. Thank you to the organizers for even the honor of being in the room, let alone being up on the podium. Make no mistake about it, I know that any one of you in this room could be up here today. Whether you're Indigenous or not, whether you're a survivor because you went to a residential school, whether you're a survivor because your family member went to a residential school, whether you're a survivor because you live in this country and the residential schools happened, I think we're all here for the same purpose. Sometimes when you hear the words of someone so wise, so elegant, so incredibly respectful, and gives you so much to contemplate, it really is best to follow with silence. Just silence. To honor the voices that have never been heard, to honor those who were heard, to listen, to reflect, to contemplate. Miigwech. Each and every one of the 94 calls to action resonated a truth and connection to me that was palpable. I think because of who I sort of associate with, whether it's colleagues, friends, family, it was not a unique response. I have to admit, thank you to Justice Senator Murray Sinclair. Thank you for the report that you and your team pulled together, but I admit I was nervous. I was scared. I was anxious to read it. I wanted to read it, but I was worried about reading something that would hurt, and I would never forget. I'd be never able to forget it. And then I felt guilty, disappointed in myself, angry at myself, because it was so hard to do, but I knew that I would demand everyone around me to read this document, and I was so scared to do it myself. Isn't that where we need to go, though, as Canadians? To the corners and to the shadows, to hear the voices previously absent and to the stories that have been previously shelved, to hear the truth. As a nation, I think we need to move past the why reconciliation and to the how. And I think that you've given us some great pointers today in terms of how to interpret that report with a different perspective. When interpreting the health of Indigenous peoples in Canada, being from the Faculty of Medicine here at UBC, at the School of Population and Public Health, and at the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health, I do realize that there's the social, the emotional, the mental, the physical, there's a whole bunch of components to health. And so, of course, all of it comes down to the cornerstone of education, definitely. You can't be on a campus, including UBC, and refer to the TRC and not address the role of education, either how it was historically or where it is currently. The residential school system was my mom's. Education. That was her perspective of elementary school and high school. It was the gatekeeper to education, to advanced education for my mom. The cost of tuition was different at that point. It included a change in name, a ban of language, a loss of ceremony, a separation from family, trading in traditional clothes, right down to losing locks of hair and seeing them fall to the floor, and to be ruthlessly thrown in a garbage can. To a little girl, that was a big step. I didn't realize this. My mom did not share this with me for a long, long time. It came out in pieces, a little bit here, a little bit there, like a story with all the chapters mixed up, with pages missing, and with entire paragraphs rubbed out, because the author didn't want anyone to know what was behind that rubbed out part. But I picked over those pages over the years and tried to put them together, page after page, until it became a novel that somewhat made sense. The TRC was hard to read, but mandatory. I could hear my mom's voice in my head. I can see her now, smiling and laughing. I actually have friends that I've had my entire life that have never seen my mom not smile. She is an amazingly powerful, resilient, empowered, beautiful, beautiful, inspiring lady. But all of a sudden I realized one day that these stories she told me about school, they were always great stories. They were happy stories. They were about a nun who would do this. They were about a friend who would do this. And they were great stories. But then I started to grow up, and I realized they were the same stories over and over and over again. And for 12 years of education, there had to be more than a handful of stories that she could share. Her advice to me as a child also didn't make any sense. When I started to grow older and put it together, I remember being in my room crying one day, and she came in and she sat down with me and she said, "Here it is, Nadine. Don't lean, and no one will ever let you down. Here it is, Nadine. Don't lie down, and no one will ever step on you." It didn't make sense for the joyous stories that came from her stories. I started to ask more questions of my mom, and then started going to the res, to my grandma and to my aunties, and asking them the stories to fill in these blanks, these missing pages. I think I got the chapters in order. I think I have most pages. There are paragraphs that will never be visualized. It's interesting because I talk to my daughter now, and she says, you know what she says to me? She says, "Don't worry, Mom, those are Grandma's stories. Those are Grandma's stories." I remember one time I went back with my mom during university to St. Joseph's residential school in Spanish. It was hard to see that name referenced in the TRC documents. And I remember going with my mom. It was just her and I was excited. I'd been there before with my grandma and my aunts and my mom with her friends, and I'd been there, but I'd never been there with just me and my mom, and I was at the age where I was asking a lot of questions. And I was so excited, and my mom was giving me directions in the passenger seat, and I was driving. It was like she had just been there yesterday. Turn here, just down here. We got there, and I opened the door, and I went running out. I was so excited. I wanted to ask her, like, where was this, and where was this, and where was this? And there were no answers. My mom was silent. I turned around. That trip to the residential school was really short. "Hey, Elia, it's Grandma's story." I saw a chink in her armor. I saw a lady that maybe wasn't happy all the time. Miigwech. I saw truth, a little bit, and it hurt, but it was important. I didn't survive residential school. But Mr. Grant, if you're here, I saw my mom cry. I saw my mom cry. So when we talk about education, I totally agree. Recently, I just helped my 9-year-old daughter study about Jacques Cartier, Cabot, Christopher Columbus. You know what? I don't want to put her on the spot, but she can name how many boats. She can name how many men in every boat. She can name exactly when they left, right down to the date. She can name where they landed. She can name the type of fish they found. She could name what they were looking for, what they found, and what they didn't find. Not a single thing in everything she brought home contained the truth to make it all make sense. Even her textbooks had missing chapters, missing pages, and blocked out paragraphs. I agree with the curriculum. The K-12 because I'm a mom. At the K-12 because I want my daughter to know this. The K to 12, because I want my daughter's friends to know this, and I want my friends' children to know this, and I want my grandchildren to know this, and I want the country to know this, because we can learn from it. I asked my daughter, just getting ready for this talk, I said, Alia, if there's one thing you could teach your kids about all this, what would you tell them, your friends at school? And her first response is, I wouldn't tell them anything. As if they wouldn't understand. And I said, come on, Alia, what would you? If they would understand and if they would listen, what would you tell them? And she said, I'd just tell them that they were really lucky, that we got to go to a school where our parents dropped us off, parents picked us up, our parents asked us every day, what did we do? Our parents gave us food, our parents controlled what we ate, that right down to, she just sort of went through the cost of tuition that my mom went through. It was insightful for sure. But I agree with the calls through education at a higher level. And I think at UBC, that's our responsibility. That's where we can have control. That's, as an Indigenous faculty at this university, I think we need to move that agenda forward, and that's what we're gonna do. You know, we have mentors like Lynn Kessler, who sits down with us and gently explains to us why and how we can make it happen. Recently at the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health, we have committed to that on a greater scale. We've had one meeting to maybe make that decision, and we have the rest of the work to do, but at least we've got a clear path. I can't thank the TRC Commission enough, because when we lobbied as the Center for Excellence to get mandatory cultural awareness training for our first year medical students as mandatory curriculum this year, you know what we did? We held up this. We held up the recommendations. You know what? It was actually pretty easy after all. Not for them, not for people who didn't think it was a good idea. But like, it wasn't that bad, hey? We just simply said that there couldn't be a worse time in history to not listen to what we are asking for. You have no grounds to stand on. You can't turn anywhere in this country and have any justification for not doing the simple thing that we're saying to do. Yeah, they were uncomfortable. I actually had a good time. I'd say that, yes, I agree. Calling to, when we're looking at health, increasing the number of Aboriginal healthcare professionals. Absolutely, absolutely. So that when you walk in the door, I had a patient come to me about a year ago. She came in, she walked down, sat down, and then she started to cry before I even said anything. And she said, "You're First Nations, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." And she started to cry. She said, "I never thought I would ever have a First Nations doc." That's all it took. All it took. Ensure retention of Aboriginal healthcare providers. I agree, because right now the need is way, way, way greater than the supply. The demand is way greater. And the thing is as an Aboriginal healthcare provider, you're not just a healthcare provider. You're also a role model, a mentor, a researcher, a policy advisor. You're sitting on boards, you're sitting on curriculum, content. You're doing so much because you need to be there. Someone's got to be there. And I know it's the same in every other faculty. So absolutely retaining Aboriginal healthcare providers. And providing the cultural competency training, not just at our trainee levels within the curriculum content of our universities, but extending past that and saying, look, we are training the future healthcare providers or teachers or lawyers, but there are people out there that are already doing it, and we need to change that landscape. We can't put out a few hundred doctors and expect them to change the entire social construct. We have to start working from the top down too and saying, you know what? We have this. Worst time in Canada to be the BC College of Physicians and Surgeons of BC and not listen to this. Worst time in Canada to be in the College of Nursing or College of Dentistry or Pharmacy or Occupational Therapy or Speech Pathology or whatever it is. Worst time to not stand up and actually take responsibility for what is supposed to be done in this nation today. Overall, I wanted to share those thoughts in terms of, in the end, if we deal with the education element of it, we can deal with the health elements to follow, definitely. There is so much in this that I was overwhelmed by the report. I found myself learning a lot from it. Your words today were inspirational. Thank you so much for that. And I wanted to end with one thing, because I know Link's going to tell me it's time to get off. I want to show you something. My mom gave me this a couple years ago, and she said, when you need strength, put this on, wrap it around, and know that I will give you all the strength that I have. You know where she got this? At her residential school reunion. She went back to Spanish. She went back with other classmates. This is the only memoir she has of her high school, not like me, where I have ridiculous amount of stuff from the joyous days of high school and elementary school. This is it. It was created by the survivors from this community. And she said, you can't let go of the past. The past is indeed who you are. It is who you are. But you can either let it break you down, or it can become your greatest strength. And when I look at my mom, I look at someone who has overcome so much and not bent a degree. She is a tree that stands upright. And I want to be like her. Because boy, I almost fall over sometimes in some of the winds that I think are hurricanes. And then I'll have to think of my mom. And I realize that I've never seen a hurricane like her. And I have her strength to guide me if I ever were to. Thank you. Miigwech.
No, Nadine. Yeah, just have a seat on stage. This is our plan to slowly fill the stage. I really want to thank you for what you said today, and as you were speaking of your mother, I was thinking of mine. I have to tell you, there was one moment in there where I wasn't sure I was hearing right when you were talking about your friend's reaction to your mother, and never not seeing her smile. And I thought, oh, that's different. When my friends always spoke about my mother, it was never seeing her smile. And I thought, well, maybe that's just a difference in the way people reacted to similar circumstances. And then I thought, and maybe Justice Sinclair will have something to say about this. I thought, well, you know, it could just be the difference between Anishinaabe people and Sioux. This is a Sioux person smiling. And with that happy thought, I would like to... I can smile. My wife taught me how to do that. You're laughing, but it's true. Our next speaker, Alanaise Goodwill. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you here today. I remember when you came to UBC, I knew you studied here, but I remember particularly when you came for a job interview at one point, and hearing about the really remarkable research you were doing, and the potential for it to be a very important part of what helps us move our country along in a much better way. So very much a pleasure to hear you speak today, and please come up and share some words with us.
Miigwech. I'm a Miigwech person too. I really want to thank the Hunkaminam speaking people for having us here today. It's such a privilege and an honor to stand on the land where you fought so hard, and we get to be here because of that, and I don't forget that. Alanaise Goodwill Indishnikas, Miskobanesi Kwe Anishinaabe Indishnitas, Anishinaabe Moksandi Bay Donjion, Stalo Territory Donjion. My name is Alanaise. My spirit name that I am called is Red Thunderbird Woman. I live in Stalo Territory. I'm very proud to have been born and raised in Stalo territory and to have benefited from the legacy of Stalo educators, such as Joanne Archibald sitting in the middle of the room. There's a strong legacy of educators here, and I find it really unusual that I get to be the one in this space for 10 minutes or so, speaking to you all. I can't speak to any size of group in Canada without residential schools being a personal issue for somebody, a hurting issue. I'm really grateful for the support I'm feeling from Dr. Caron as she's sitting here next to me, because we were talking about how daunting and intimidating it is to speak about this topic. Why is it hard to prepare ourselves to talk about this? And unless you were lying to me, Dr. Caron said she hadn't prepared anything at all. So what you just heard her say came right out of her, flowed right out of her. I wanted to say something in my ancient language, my Anishinaabeg language, because that's my theme, I guess. I had a theme to use about reconciliation is the repatriation and the reuse of our Indigenous ancient languages and how important that is for our healing. I really like your name, Gijik. That means the sun, right? Yeah, okay. You'll give me a yes for now. My son shares a name with you. The other thing I wanted to talk about, I think it's really great how all the panelists are women. And I'm going to take Dr. Caron's lead and talk about my mom for a little bit, because I think that when we're nervous and we're hurting and we're in pain, we always cry for our mums. And that's a privilege that wasn't afforded to my mom or her grandmother or other children that went to residential school. So I said, Mom, can you come over and help me prepare to say something in Ojibwe, please? I could only give you what I could say that I feel confident pronouncing. But I felt it was really important to speak my language to you today because it's an act of attacking shame. So many of us are ashamed to speak our language, to mispronounce, to conjugate the verbs wrong, to be pointed at, oh, you don't know your language, you don't know your culture. And if that's missing about you, what else is missing? So while I'm trying to cobble together my sense of self, I asked my mom to prepare me because it's a really big deal to speak in your presence, Honorable Sinclair, Senator Sinclair. So I asked her by text, can you come over and help me practice my Ojibwe pronunciation? She says, I'm reading the text to you now because this is for you. Okay, I can come over and help you tell him how grateful our people are for his extraordinary contribution to our resurgence. We honor and hold him in highest esteem. We thank him for his courage, his wisdom, and generous spirit. He is the medicine that has precipitated our healing, a great and humble man. He is our crazy horse, our Chief Seattle, our Elijah. My mom endured 9 years in Sandy Bay Indian Residential School. So did everybody else in my family. It's hard to talk about, and many of you are feeling a lot of things right now, so I encourage you to do what you need to do to feel my words like a medicine, to be present, so we can recover together. I know my time is running out, but I wanted to say one more thing to all of you. Because I guess I'm here as the Faculty of Education person. And there's lots of Faculty of Education people here. There's such a thing as a course called Reconciliation Through Education that was designed by my colleague, Dr. Jan Hare, who's sitting in the middle. And at UBC, we call them Massive Open Online Courses, or MOOCs. And it really gives you an opportunity to listen to elders, wisdom keepers, Indigenous people, leaders, educators, talk about the multiple meanings of reconciliation. Because I'm sure, as you've heard all across Canada, what does that mean? Is that word in our language? Is there a word for reconciliation in our language? Is that a European thing? Why are we struggling with this so much? So you can take this MOOC, and a lot of people try to unravel that and untie that and present that. So I'm really grateful for the Faculty of Education for creating that space before any of the recommendations came out. So I honor you, Dr. Hare. And Dr. Kirkness, it goes without saying, we wouldn't have what we have at UBC. We wouldn't enjoy what we are enjoying without your work. So thank you very much. One last thing, I can't shut up. I asked my uncle, Dr. Robert Houle, who's a painter, an artist, and a survivor. I asked him, what does reconciliation mean to you? And it's the opposite of what I think we're trying to achieve with Canadians. But for him, a survivor, says it means pegitandan. That's the closest word in our ancient language. What that means is to let something go from your mind. That talks about the memory trauma that kind of continues and plays over and over and over again. And yet we hear Canadians say, I didn't know. And then here's this other group of people who are really trying not to know. We just don't want to know anymore. So coming together on what that means, that reconciliation word, I think I'm still stuck at truth. I think that reconciliation is going to be the fact that I am here, that Dr. Caron is here, Dr. Hunt, Dr. Johnston, that we're all here, we're descendants of this horrible legacy, but I'm also the recipient of a lot of hard work. The men and women that came before me, I would not be here if it wasn't for what they went through. Kichimigwech.
I don't think that we hope that you would come and speak to us as a representative of anything, but because you would share such powerful words as you did. So thank you for coming and speaking today. Our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Hunt, and Sarah has joined UBC's faculty quite recently. I'm happy to say in the Department of Geography, but also in the First Nations and Indigenous Studies program. And it's been really a pleasure to see her make the choice to join us. She is a geographer, but has also done, I think, some really interesting work with murdered and missing women and a lot of quite significant issues. So again, it's a real pleasure to have you join us today and say a few words.
Gila Kasla. Thanks so much for that introduction. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I want to begin by, again, acknowledging the Musqueam people whose unceded territories we're on, and to acknowledge that I'm a guest here. And it's a great honor, and my goal is always to be a good guest, and I'm figuring out what that means every day. So I want to, of course, acknowledge Justice Sinclair for your words and your presence today and all of your work. It's really an honor to be able to speak. I think the other speakers kind of echoed what I'm feeling right now, which is that it's hard to know what to say. There's so much to say. So I did type out some comments, knowing that I might not be able to be quite as eloquent as the previous two off the cuff. So a lot of what I have to say echoes, I think, the focus on truth. Thinking about the truths that have come out through the TRC is really the theme that I want to speak to. So over the past 9 months, I think it's been since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released the list of 94 calls to action, there's been a lot of conversation, really vital conversation on how to move forward. Online, in classrooms and different government offices, offices here as well, people have urged a real engagement with each of the action items in order to move ahead with reconciliation. And as we heard from Justice Sinclair, these recommendations are aimed at various decision makers, at government, largely looking to bring about changes in the continuation of colonialism in today's laws, policies, and importantly in educational practices, which continue to wrap their tentacles within and around our homes and families today. But as a Kwagilth woman whose work involves issues of violence in our communities, I'm afraid I'm still stuck on the T of the TRC on this issue of truth. And as we heard during the hearings, residential school survivors and their families gathered to open up their box of stories. When I attended the hearings in Victoria to support some of my loved ones who are testifying, I was overwhelmed by the swell of all these memories surfacing and bubbling and mingling together. It was immense, this wave of truth. Many of these stories have been kept quiet for years, and some of them had never been told before. Some of these stories had remained deep inside the hearts, spirits, minds, and bodies of people who had endured acts, some of which were truly unspeakable. Yet during the hearing, survivors put those unspeakable traumas into words. Released from having been silenced or cloaked in shame, these diverse recollections of pain, but also of resistance and rebellion, were powerful. These stories each hold within them the life of a child who was denied their right to grow up nurtured as a member of their own community, their own family, and as we heard, to know or to be themselves, to know what that means, to know who they are. We know that many more stories, although felt within our community, still remain unspoken. Some people may not be ready to share, and they may never be ready to share, and many others died before they could speak their truths. And I like to think that as we reconnect with our spirit world, with our kind of ancestral guides, and foster deeper relations there, perhaps the unspoken traumas can be transformed somehow, even those stories that haven't been spoken. The TRC opened up space for Indigenous peoples' residential schools' truths to be told, but in my work on violence, I've seen that this truth-telling isn't over. In many of our communities, intergenerational abuse and other expressions of these ongoing traumas continue within a culture of silence. Displacement from our territories is ongoing. Dehumanization does continue every day in treatment by police and in various systems and education, including in the ways, as I've seen, and survivors are not believed when they do truth tell about their childhood experiences. We see this in the stories, for example, that surfaced about John Furlong's role in Burns Lake, where there was this running to his defense, trying to kind of discredit the survivors that were speaking out. This doesn't mean the abuse didn't happen, but that the victims couldn't prove it to the satisfaction of the police, as those cases were dismissed over the months. So I think colonial power continues to express itself in these processes, which rely on other people to decide whether or not Indigenous people are deemed capable of telling our truths, whether we're credible, really. In order to open up space to continue then to truth tell and to have our truths validated, I think we need to learn to listen differently. And I hope that the TRC can be the start of that. And as we heard Justice Sinclair speak to earlier, these educational processes that are really vital, hopefully will teach us all, and especially people who haven't been listening, to listen differently. While many of the action items are aimed at teaching Canadians then to hear us, I also want to encourage Indigenous people to consider how we can foster this vibrant truth-telling, this ongoing opening up, through unlearning the silencing fostered in residential schools. What other truths do we have to tell that aren't being heard? So I have my own complicated history, genealogy related to residential schools. Others spoke of their own mom's experiences, and I have my own, but it's not what you might expect. I thought today was an important day to also truth tell about this. So on my father's side, a number of my dad's generation were taken from our family in the related 60s scoop movement, but they were thankfully returned from home eventually. While my mother, who's Ukrainian and English, in her early 20s and interested in social work, actually worked for a year at the Port Alberni Residential School. She quickly realized what a violent system she was working in and quit after only a year, but during that time she was intimately involved in the lives of the girls who were being institutionalized there. I grew up seeing family photos, of the time she took a group of the girls home for Christmas because they weren't given any money to return home to their families. Truth-telling takes many forms, and in part I learned about the schools in part because we didn't hear a lot talked about in society about my own mom's honesty about her involvement in the school, and also because she's still friends with a lot of the people she met there. Only as a teen did I begin to realize exactly what these family photos meant, what harrowing and genocidal history they were a part of. My mom said she lobbied the administration to get wool to teach the kids to knit because they didn't have any fun or creative things to do, and she was given 5 balls of yarn for 32 kids. With the best of intentions and a good heart, she developed close relationships with many of those girls, and as I said, is still in touch with many of them, as she enacts her own accountability for being part of their years of growing up, forced to live away from their family. And for me, these good intentions serve as a reminder of the continuation of colonial policy in today's child welfare system, also made up of people who are still trying to get more balls of yarn, trying to reduce harm within a deeply harmful system that, as we heard, claims to save our children. While harm reduction is an essential strategy for daily survival under colonialism, we need to imagine beyond this. We need our homes to be revitalized as spaces of self-determination, cultural revitalization, sovereign spaces in which our kids can grow up on their own terms and truly know their place in the world, as Justice Sinclair said. With this complicated genealogy, I'm unsure if reconciliation can capture the relational healing and reparation that's needed to mend the ongoing impacts of residential schools. Those girls will never be able to recapture the lost years they spent with my mother rather than their own. And I hear over and over again that Indigenous youth are still being treated as irreconcilable subjects. Reading over the list of actions to be taken up by government and policymakers, by lawyers and universities, I was struck also by the ways that these important systemic changes and government involvement in our homes and families mirror shifts that are needed in everyday attitudes and actions. Ongoing expressions of colonization are enacted as well between individuals who make up systems of power, individuals who are our neighbors, who we live and breathe alongside. For example, a number of the action items focused on addressing the underlying claims of terra nullius, which rested on Indigenous peoples' dehumanization and facilitated our subjugation under an imposed order of governance, while our own systems of law were ignored. I don't know how the Canadian government will take up the calls to address that underlying injustice of terra nullius. That's a puzzle they can figure out. But what I'm concerned with changing is the ways that terra nullius structures our individual engagement, so how we identify ourselves and each other. And I'm reminded here of a painting by artist and educator Aaron Consmo, who's a part of the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. I do a lot of work with Indigenous youth, entitled "Our Bodies Are Not Terra Nullius." Indigenous people, particularly girls and women and Two-Spirit people, continue to have their self-determination denied through having their bodies trespassed without their consent, through being told what to do with their bodies, being labeled and stigmatized, through having their control over their bodies and lives denied. Truly eliminating then this premise of terra nullius from these lands means looking at the ways our legal subjectivities are formed in our everyday interactions, not just through formal law and policy. Importantly there as well, of course. Because as the survivors shared, it was through everyday abuses that residential school policy was realized. So I think looking at the way that we can take responsibility in everyday life is really important. As well, I want to speak to the gendered nature of residential schools, which was expressed in these everyday relations. So we know through what we heard in people's testimony and just in the history of residential schools, that the separation of brothers and sisters, the enforcement of boys and girls' dress codes and hairstyles, the instilling of Western gender norms seemed suitable for Indian children. The erasure of anyone who didn't fit into those boxes was key. And of course, the kinds of discipline that was meted out to boys and girls was also gendered. So just as I think about terra nullius in kind of our everyday lives, so too I think must these imposed models of gender be addressed. Action item 41 calls for action around missing and murdered women, which is a very important area that we do see very slowly, some movement on. But the depth of gendered inequality rooted in residential schools extends much deeper. The ripples of trauma that run through our communities continue to be inequitably felt by young women, something that women and girls have been talking about and resisting for decades. And some people have been listening and are listening more and more. This is not something that can be reconciled, though, through an inquiry alone, as young women of the future generations, I think, will have to decide what their measure of justice will be. And I hope that we will be able to hear them by thinking about listening differently. Finally, I want to end by saying that residential schools were spaces in which children and youth were dehumanized and where people attempted to turn our relatives into colonial subjects. But they resisted, just as Indigenous youth resist colonization today. And in the list of action items, I saw one speaking specifically to youth, which really resonated with me. I think we need to all hold ourselves accountable to today's youth and tomorrow's to ensure we avoid replicating these views in which youth are viewed through a dehumanizing lens. And I'm involved in some research with the National Indigenous Youth Council on HIV/AIDS, and they're looking at how the label at risk continues to impact young people. We see, I think, with the history of the residential school, precisely what has put youth at risk. We see these systemic harms, but we continue to label youth as being risky instead of these systems as being risky. Just as the stories of those who survived their childhoods in the schools ring out through our communities, so too must we attend to the powerful stories that Indigenous youth are trying to make us hear today. I encourage us all to consider additional ways we can restore youth to their places of honor in our communities. And much of the work youth are doing today has very little funding or support. And we can all think about supporting their work, donating to organizations like the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, to put a plug in for them because they're awesome, which may not be precisely about reconciliation, but that they are certainly about restoring the self-determination and agency that young people want to have in their everyday life. We must consider how to radically reimagine Indigenous children and youth as citizens of their own nations, not just as wards of the state. So I want to end with a final story my mom told me about her time at Port Alberni. She talked about the summer days when the girls would gather in the hot sun out in the schoolyard without much to do. And there was a fence that marked the periphery of the yard. And on the other side of that fence was a swimming pool for the daughter of the school principal. The girls could do nothing but watch as the daughter swam in the pool while they had to stand in the sun. And my mom would take them down to the river for a walk or to cool off. And the truth I think that we have to continue to wrestle with is that Indigenous youth are still looking from the other side of that fence, and that it's time we tear that fence down. So many communities in this country are without drinkable water, without proper housing. Our children still scooped up in systems in which they die from neglect. We hear these stories over and over again here in BC. So for myself, my call to action begins with thinking about how I can decolonize my own mind, seeking to better hear the continuum of historic and current truths of colonization. So thinking about taking the lead from this TRC process, how can we learn to listen to these stories differently? Thank you.
Sarah, you began by drawing our attention back to the question of silences and breaking of silences. And I think one of the things that that really made me think about was, well, for me personally, the point in my career where I began speaking about the kind of issues we're talking about today for the first time in my professional life. And I remember how difficult it was and how badly I did it because I had no language. We grow up in that silence. We do not learn a way to speak about it. And we have to find that for ourselves. And often the route to doing that is very difficult. And as you concluded in talking about people having ways, the language in which to conceive of their own lives in ways that give them more and better options, a really similar formidable task exists in front of us. But I want to take a minute to stop And one more time, thank Justice Sinclair and everyone involved in the TRC, because they took us a long way down the road to having the language to be able to speak more effectively and more respectfully among ourselves about these issues. And I've listened to your speeches for years and really appreciated the way in which you developed the discourse and our ability to think and talk about the issues. So thanks to everyone who's speaking here today for helping us to do that, but certainly to the long work of the Commission and everyone who participated in it, and all those survivors who spoke perhaps for the first time and with great difficulty, that helped us all to find a way to think and speak about this really critical history. We have one more speaker, saving the best for last, of course. Professor Darlene Johnston from our Faculty of Law. And it's been a real pleasure for me to have Professor Johnston as a colleague here. She comes to us having done a lot of work with communities, but also a great wealth of knowledge as a professor of law. And recently I was in a conference where I was sitting next to Darlene, who to me had always been a very friendly presence in many a meeting, but always pretty quiet. And Darlene just decided that she needed to say something about one of the things we were talking about. And it was some of the most perfectly formed, beautiful and dense 2 minutes of exposition on a topic that I actually knew not too much about, being that it was law, and I just try to avoid speeding tickets. It was really a highlight of the year for me. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you here today to share a few words with us.
It's actually quite hard to be the last one to speak, but that's what I get for being the last one to submit my bio for the... So, to begin with, I would like to thank Capilano Howard Grant for his very generous welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge Justice Sinclair and all the wonderful and difficult work that you have done. To introduce myself as I've been taught, Ani Bojo, Nakwegijiko Indigenous, Wabjeshi Nindodem, Nashting Niming Donjiba, Nishnabe Koindao. I'm a Martin person, Martin clan. My name means noonday woman, from a place known in English as Cape Croker in Ontario. And people talk about degrees of separation, but it's remarkable that Nadine's mother and my father, they didn't go to the same residential school. There was a boys' school and a girls' school, but they were both at what's known as Spanish on the north shore of Lake Huron. My dad was sent to Spanish when he was 11 years old. He ran away when he was 17. He didn't talk about his experience when we were children. And one of the things that I've struggled with in terms of the work of the Commission and the discourse is the term survivor, because my dad actually wouldn't call himself a survivor. And I know survivor is better than victim, but I've been trying to think of other language that might help. And the first time he talked to me about residential schools, I just started university. It was 2 months in my first year, and I came home for a weekend, and when it was time to leave, I started crying. I said, no, I don't want to go back. I really can't do that. I don't want to go. And my dad, that's the very first time he spoke to me about residential schools, and he said, I know what that's like. He said, they sent me away, and he said it was like going into this big bubble, that you were just so isolated and so separated from everything that you knew and loved. And he said, you know, I wasn't a big kid, and so he got picked on, and he realized, though, that he was a good boxer. He said, I was fast. I was small, but I was fast. And he said, I'd punch them once, and they'd be surprised. and he said, and I'd punch them again while they were falling down. And so, you know, he has this. So he basically, I think the message to me was, you know, I got through it. You can get through it. And so far, so good. But when I think about this idea of survivor, then it's like for my dad, he didn't share this to me until he thought I needed it, until he thought that it would give him, he could give me strength by telling me about it. And so I wish there was language to talk about the strength and the bravery that the former students carry and pass on. And the one word I've thought about in Anishinaabe is Ogitchida. It's like this idea of just a really strong, powerful person. And maybe sometimes we have to do that. We have to flip out of English and into our ancestral language. Because I'm a law professor, I expect I should speak to call to action number 28. That's the one that deals with law schools. There's also one that deals with law societies, call to action number 27. But I've heard a number of people say that it would be hard to look at any of the 93 recommendations and not see a role for law to play, not see the implications that have for justice or injustice. So call to action 28 calls for law schools to have a mandatory course on Aboriginal peoples and treaty rights and the United Nations Declaration and the history of residential schools and the building of intercultural competency, which I think will be the biggest stretch for our faculties. And I'm happy to say that UBC does have a mandatory course in first year. I'm sad to say there's that we don't have enough time to cover everything we need to cover, and that we have to really rely on our colleagues to take up the work as well, both in first year and the upper year. And actually I have a colleague I'd like to acknowledge here, Emma Cunliffe, who's done amazing work in opening up the criminal law syllabus to issues affecting Aboriginal people, as well as her work in evidence law. And there is something called the Reconciliation Syllabus, which is online, and it's a collection of law professors across the country who are collaborating to say, this is what I'm trying to do in my class, and you can search the materials by courses. And I think that would be a good thing for any discipline, in fact, to think about is sharing across the country, basically, to pool our resources. But even though number 28 is important, my personal favorite is number 45. And that talks about the Royal Proclamation and a call for the Government of Canada to develop jointly with Aboriginal peoples a Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation that would build on the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara 1764. And one of the reasons that speaks so powerful to me is that my ancestors met with Sir William Johnston in August of 1764 to negotiate the Treaty of Niagara. And that was a time when our people were so strong and our territory was respected, our protocols were respected. The treaty was made by the exchange of wampum belts as opposed to being written down in English. And the stories and those belts have been carried for generations. And so I just wanted to share with you one rendition of the Treaty of Niagara that was captured in an eventually became an archival document, but was a petition from a number of chiefs on Manitoulin Island to the British Crown's representative, and they were writing because they were being pressed by local officials to surrender their land, and they were saying, no, that's not what the deal was. It was actually, we were promised that we would never have to give up this land. And so they basically went through a very long process of describing the promises that had been made to them. And I'll just give you one little excerpt. This is Sir William Johnston speaking to the chiefs. And this, by the way, is at the end of the 7 Years' War, and they wanted the chiefs to align with them so that the French wouldn't come back and try to take Canada again. So this goes to the very constitutional foundation of what we now know as Canada. And so William Johnston said, when you look around you under the vaulted heaven, looking for the life of your children, when you turn your gaze towards the rising sun, you shall see that sun rising red, similar to the color of the coat that I wear. When it rises higher, that same sun shall be very bright with light. There is the image of the life of your children. After that sun has been up a little longer, you'll see in different places the flowers bloom. There is the image of the life of your children. And the people made these decisions, and in some cases compromises and losses, because they were committed to a view of the life of their children. And then when we think then about what happened with the residential schools and what continues to happen with the child welfare systems, how many children we lose each year to suicide, we're not seeing flowers blooming as a metaphor for the life of our children. And sometimes I think it's easy to be overwhelmed by the task or the challenge of reconciliation. Sometimes I have questions, how will we ever know when we get there? And I know it's going to be an ongoing relationship indefinitely, but personally for me, when our children are living as well as other children in Canada, then I'll feel like we're on the road to reconciliation. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for all of that. You've given everyone quite a lot to think about, and our intention is to open the floor in a minute to questions that people may have and an ongoing discussion. But I thought it might make sense to take a minute and see if any of you have comments on what you've heard from your colleagues today, or anything that you would like to follow up on before we have a more general call for questions. Yeah? Okay.
I just feel three times more hopeful than I felt massively more hopeful after this early afternoon's talk. So I'd like to thank my three colleagues for their wisdom and sharing, and I cannot wait to talk to you. I think maybe your dad and my dad, or my mom, can talk.
I think, this is a really important point, because I know that the work that the TRC did and all of the people who contributed to it was quite somber work. It was very, very difficult, without a doubt. And many of the discussions, even here at the university, that we have in various meetings and committees can take on a similar tone. But I believe that everyone who participated in the TRC process was, in some sense, and certainly the commissioners, without a doubt, were optimists, because they would not have worked that hard if they didn't believe that things could change and be better. And I think that's in the spirit of everything that's been said here today. Anyone else before we general call for questions? I think we do have a microphone that's going to, there it is, rove through the crowd. So we would like to hear what your questions might be. It would, we're going to have, after this period, for a little bit of more further discussion, there's going to be plenty of opportunity to meet and talk with people informally and to pursue different ideas and have other discussions. So I think for this period, I really would like to ask you to try to frame your thoughts as questions that others may comment on rather than as statements, and to be brief so that a number of people can speak. So with those thoughts in mind, does anyone have a question they would like to pose? I'm also attentive to the fact that we've got a very serious gender imbalance issue here today on our panel. And I'm hoping that it would not surprise me if a comment or two might be directed to Justice Sinclair as well. And I think we have, would you like to see that? Yeah, I mean, then you have to stand unless we move the podium and give you a seat, which we could do.
We can move over.
You comfortable standing? Oh, look at that. Okay. Bring a chair. There's a microphone on that chair. Thank you. And I would like to remind you, panelists, if you're moving around, this is a pretty narrow platform.
Yes.
So be very careful.
Oh, I'm going to fall off.
Yeah, no.
Okay, if I fall, I'm pulling you with me.
I know.
Oh, you've got right there.
I'll need some medical help. I'm sure. Am I close to falling?
No, maybe just let's see.
Why don't I just stand back here?
Well,
We can do that.
It's too risky, this chair.
can we move the podium?
We can move the
No,
podium,
no,
too,
no,
and
just leave
then-
it there. I'll
but
just
then
stand back.
you can move that up.
I'll just stand back here.
Use this one to your response. Microphone.
You want to give me a hand here?
I'll use this one if we need to.
The original plan, Ray, was for you to be here at the podium
All right.
and for Ling to have that mic.
Oh.
If you don't mind standing just
No.
then that will be fine. So everyone's got a mic.
Guilty of being too accommodating.
Yeah, lots of time to prepare your questions.
Now, you can stretch your legs. And we'll give you a
There we go.
yes.
We can move over a bit.
All right.
There you go.
Okay, do we have a question?
Hello, thank you. This is Dr. Rosalind Ng. I'm a Cree from the Opaskwayak Cree Nation, but I've lived here in Vancouver area for 30 years. I want to thank Senator Justice Murray Sinclair for the hard work that you've done these past 6 years and the sacrifices you made and the courage it took to endure listening to all of the heartbreaking stories and some of the good ones too that emerged from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I want to thank you for also reinforcing, I guess, my desire to continue to walk with dignity and strength despite the oppression and the pain I had to endure as a child who spent 11 years at residential schools. I guess I want to focus on next year, because next year, 2017, is supposed to be the 150th birthday celebration of Canada. And I no, I have no desire to praise or give credit to any father of Confederation who considered me a savage. But I wonder in what other ways Canadians can consider the future and how they can use a 150-year birthday celebration to advance and to help Aboriginal people in this country. I heard the Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation. That to me would be an appropriate theme, but how do we take that to the level, that it requires to become policy or a major theme of the 150th celebration of Canada?
I think that sounds like a question for a senator.
Nice lateral, Nadine. Very, very nice.
I'm beginning to regret my decision. So, I've been in discussions with a number of people who are involved in the planning for next year to convince them that next year really needs to be less a year of celebration as a year of acknowledgement, as a year of change, as a year of an opportunity to start over again, to get it right the second time. Because from the Aboriginal perspective, there is relatively more to talk about in terms of what negativity has come from this first 150 years than the benefits of it. And so, to this point in time, I'm not convinced that everybody's bought my message, but I think it's a message that they're going to hear whether they like it or not. And I've warned them of that. I've said if you spend the whole year simply celebrating and trying to find somebody to come up with another Bobby Jimby kind of song, you're going to find that people are going to be burning effigies against what it is that you're trying to attain. And that would not be a good message going forward. The better message is continue to recognize that that country has not lived up to its own image of itself, but that we can do better, and we will do better, and here's how we will do better. That's the message that I think needs to come out of the 150th anniversary of Confederation. And it may be with the new administration that message may have a better reception. With the previous administration, it was not a well-received message. So, but I think there's opportunity there for us to talk about getting it right, and I think that we will see soon, I hope, that commitment is going to be made to it, to do that. Because if it isn't how the year is celebrated, then this whole exercise will be set back quite a significant distance. And even with that, we know that there are lots of people with a lot of anger still within them. A lot of people who will not believe in the words that are being expressed, who will not believe in anything less than significant steps of action. And until that happens, then the words will simply be words. And so part of the year has to be some kind of significant gesture, such as legislation, a royal proclamation, or the establishment of a Council for Reconciliation. So next year has got to be seen as an opportunity, and we have to do something with next year. So I want to say that that's not a message that's been lost on me, and the importance of it. So, and I do want to respond to some of the comments that they've said, but I'll wait until we've heard from your questions first, because there was a lot of fodder there that I think I'd like to comment upon.
Another question from any of you?
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Georgina Martin, and I obtained my PhD here at UBC. And I'm just wanting to know from your perspective whether or not you might sense any room for older scholars in the academy. I'm noticing that since I've invested my later years in getting my degree, it's been so difficult to break into the academic world, and mostly younger people in their 30s are taken a lot sooner than people like me, and I'm a residential school survivor from my dad and from myself, so I'm feeling that I've got quite a bit to offer. Thank you.
Sounds like a comment should come from somebody with the university.
I can speak from it in terms of the discussions that we have at the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. In terms of addressing various education. Education to me and to many of my colleagues that I work with is attainment of understanding and knowledge. You don't need to go to a university for that. So what we try to do is reach out for those who want to jump that and over to the academia world and come to a place like UBC where it is a degree or it is the sort of the Western type of education. Recognizing that a lot was learned in whatever field they were in and where they were and what their life path was. For example, I can't see you, but I can hear wisdom in your voice. You would probably have a lot to teach me in terms of how this document can be made real and steps can be made to be taken. And so one of the things is I think it's a responsibility of post-secondary institutions to recognize, even in the application process, what does it take to get into UBC and how do we address it so that we can acknowledge that wisdom comes in various forms, not necessarily with a bunch of initials after your name. That doesn't mean anything. Anything different to me than wisdom obtained in real life and in the trenches and with experience. And so we are doing that at UBC, but we need to push that even further down the envelope and then create curriculum and create content and create programs and create opportunities so that it's things that people do want to pursue, not just in their 20s because it's the next thing to do, but in their 50s or in their 40s or in their 60s when it's something that they know that they can make a change and they can have impact if they gain that type of information and that type of knowledge. Then we have to address, well, okay, that's really hard. How do you get the financial means and the social means to be able to come then to university and post-secondary education, especially when you now have family commitments and you're entrenched in your community perhaps even more. And so that's what we're working on in the health sciences is addressing the admissions criteria so that we honor knowledge of all forms. Addressing who we target as potential students, realizing that UBC would be lucky to have more people like you coming at your stage in your life path. And then how do we address the barriers so that more people who have those dreams are realized? And then I think that's part of the answer is getting more people to apply in whatever stage of life they are in if UBC has something for them. And then it's UBC's responsibility to have things that you want to pursue and working together. And so we're trying to do that, I know, in the health sciences. But it is a challenge. And the other thing is it's a challenge once you're even in academia. And I did notice in terms of in this document, it's talking about supporting not just getting more Aboriginal healthcare providers, but supporting those and helping to retain those healthcare providers, having that mentorship and that role models for further up. And it's something that comes up in the health sciences quite a bit. If you want to look at the Indigenous faculty at UBC in the health sciences, you've just done it. You've just done it. UBC needs to address that. And I think that, and that's part of it, is having people with your wisdom and your expertise coming to UBC and us recognizing as an institution not to ever let you go.
One of the great impacts of evolution of society has been that the more that society appears to advance along a road of, I'm not quite sure whether you'd call it improvement or advancement or whatever term you use, the more it moves the goalposts for those who have been left behind. And Martin Luther King Jr. in one of his speeches said that we keep breaking down the doors to be able to get into the race, he said, only to find that the runners are already 50 yards ahead of us. And so we have to take a number of options, and one is to get into the race earlier. And there he's talking about getting our young people to understand that they will be the ones who will make that more equal in the future, but that at this point in time, we are the ones that are breaking down the doors, and eventually they will be the beneficiaries of that work. But we also have to get those who are involved in the institutions to recognize that they have to stop moving the goalposts. At one point in time, it used to be relatively easy to get employment just on the basis of your experience, and that you had the experience and the skills to be able to do what the job asked of you. Now, you need at least a high school education for some jobs where high school education literally is irrelevant to the work that you're going to be doing. Or you have to have a BA to do something where a university education is irrelevant to the tasks that you're going to be assigned. Or you have to have a master's degree, or you have to have a PhD in order to qualify to get into the race. And so moving the goalposts has got to be seen as a potential source of systemic discrimination. And we need to get institutions to begin to recognize that, because the people who are moving the goalposts are the people who are benefiting from moving the goalposts. And by moving the goalposts, they are protecting their own interests, and they have to stop moving the goalposts.
That's, I think, a really important point, and it also helps me to understand why they were not impressed at the cab company with my PhD when I first got it. Another question out there? Yes.
Bojo Miigwech, for your very kind words, generous words, and very helpful words today. I teach in the Faculty of Education, and we have a required course as well in Indigenous education for all our pre-service teachers. They are required to take that as part of their program. And you know, I will get to a question link. I was in Ottawa, and when they made the announcement about required instruction for those in the professions, and you know, sitting with a whole group of scholars, and I was feeling very excited and inspired that we had this course, but listening to these scholars across Canada say, you know, they were excited about this, but we're also concerned about, you know, who's going to teach these courses then, and the kinds of responsibility and that comes with it. So I'm just interested to know what we can learn from other disciplines, such as medicine, that's wanting to move towards required instruction, and law, where there is a required course. I mean, what are some lessons that we can take away for our other disciplines, for our other programs around required instruction in Indigenous worldviews, Indigenous perspectives, and providing that education for our professions? Thanks.
So at the law school, we've had the Indigenous course. I think it's into its third year now, mandatory. And it's funny, everything in first year is mandatory. And nobody else complains about anything being mandatory because it's understood just to be core, right? You can't get out of first year without property and contracts and torts and whatever. So It was actually a bit of a hurdle getting it in place, but it hasn't been as difficult as the people who resisted it, I think, thought that it would be. One of the advantages we have at the law school, our first year is divided into 4 sections, so you need 4 different people to teach the class. We have 3 Aboriginal scholars in our law school, and the people who have been teaching the other section are there's been one professor whose whole career has been involved in Aboriginal law, and then another practitioner. So we don't have a problem in terms of being able to deliver the course, but I think that would be very faculty specific. You might have some faculties with no Aboriginal scholars, and so that I think that would create an obligation for the university and the various departments. I think it would be too easy to say we can't do it because we don't have the people. If you don't have the people, you have to get the people.
One of them is, I think there are different ways of thinking about curriculum that require different levels of expertise and can be functional in different ways. And that's a longer discussion that I think we really need to have here at the university. The other thing I'll add is that about 20 years ago, I was working 400 miles south of here in Oregon, and we established 2 university-wide requirements, one of which was quite stringent. And as we set that in place, we recognized that it might be a couple of years before it could be a hard requirement because there wouldn't be enough courses to fulfill it, and that was the case, but we got there. But in the process, we set out some ground rules for teaching. Never by a grad student, never by a sessional instructor, only by teachers or faculty members, no matter how experienced, who'd completed a very intensive training program. Because part of what happens in required courses is that discussions can become quite contentious. Some people are there because they want to be and want to understand the curriculum. Some people resent having to take the course and are quite resistant. And for faculty members who are not experienced in conducting good discussions in that kind of an environment, and certainly for new teachers, the results of being unprepared are quite catastrophic. So I think those are things that can be done, but they have to be done deliberately, and they certainly have to have the support of senior faculty who are have experience, have protection against the potentially low evaluations they may get, and that would affect a pre-tenure faculty member. But most importantly, so that the curriculum can be effective and can have the desired effect of engaging people and not mobilizing their resistance by the fact of a requirement.
And when it comes to medicine, I'm just thinking specifically the School of Medicine and the recent introduction of the mandatory course. One thing that we're really looking at is it the optimal curriculum? And I think that's an ongoing question to continue to optimize it. And we do have, we have had multiple discussions about that. There are not enough people, Indigenous physicians, to teach Indigenous medical students and non-Indigenous medical students. There just aren't enough. But if what we're doing, for example, in this course, it's the Indigenous cultural awareness. It's the curriculum was developed actually by the Provincial Health Services Authority. People that, if you want to look for dedicated people, these people are in the trenches and absolutely truly believe in what they're doing and why they're doing it and are good at what they do. But if we're really endorsing this cultural awareness, cultural humility, cultural competency, like I said, we're endorsing this and the need for it, then I think that what we've got to do is look in the mirror and say, we need faculty that understand it. So we need to do that faculty development. And if we're saying it's mandatory, so this is where I started off being silent, but I'm not silent. Like, if we're saying that it's mandatory for our future medical students that are going to become doctors to have this course, then we need to say that it's mandatory for our current doctors to have this course. And we need to tackle this not just so that when we're working on it at one level, that eventually down the road, in the 10 years that it takes for them to become a surgeon and they're working, that they're going to be hopefully a little bit more culturally aware than their predecessors. We need to tackle it from the other end as well and start having that type of training and education from currently working physicians. And one other thing that we did at the center this year, that is a tiny step, but it was a mandatory question at the College of Physicians and Surgeons of BC this year. If you wanted to have a license in British Columbia as a physician, you had to answer a question. Have you taken the Indigenous Cultural Awareness course? You had to answer it. If you didn't want to answer it, you didn't get your license. At least that's a start, because a lot of questions were, well, what's that? And then there was a hyperlink and you could click, and then off you went to where, here's how you can get it. And so I think we can start, it's a multi-pronged approach. And then the K-12, I'm excited about that, because all of a sudden it becomes much more part of who you are as a Canadian student, whether it's in elementary school, high school, or university. It becomes more and more part of how you develop as a Canadian, regardless of your course of study and your career path. It's multi-pronged approach. But having said that, if you're working on that, we'd love to get your expertise in that area for sure.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has one.
Right there.
Ah.
Firstly, thank you all for coming and spending the afternoon with us. It's meant a lot to hear first Justice Murray Sinclair, but then also hear some strong Indigenous females talking about how your responses to the document. I guess my question is, some of you talked about specifically how you would use the document, how you would use the TRC recommendations. Can you give us a kind of example of your sort of dream in the spaces that you work in, how you would use the TRC to make movement towards increasing Indigenous and Aboriginal student success? Nice and easy, right?
Yeah. One of you guys want to take it?
1 minute.
Yeah.
It's always that last question that really is the focus for the next conference.
I can say something briefly that hasn't come up, but it's a fundamental issue when we look at postgraduate education and the role of research. Whenever you see research, eyes of administration of the postgraduate institution go up and they light up, because it's an important part of what you do. And then, of course, it's an important part of how we understand this. We have questions, and part of it are real obvious answers, but part of them is, okay, how are we going to deal with those health disparities? Well, first of all, we need a heck of a lot more research on that. And so one area I can say that that's been occupying so much of my time recently is taking this to places like the CIHR, or the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. Mm-hmm. There is a crisis in Indigenous health research in Canada right now, and I can't tell you, it's like this is my bow and arrow. Like, I just bring it in to the governing council and I just put it on the table and say, if you haven't read that, if you haven't read this, read this, or get off the governing council. Read this. This is what we're supposed to do, because there's only like a few of us, and this is what the country is saying. And so I think that that's one area, because success is in different forms, and one area we haven't touched on today is research. And this truly is a powerful tool to bring to any discussion where people just don't realize the importance of this movement and these calls to actions, and the fact that these are not suggestions. They're not negotiable. And the more people hear that, I think the more that it's going to start to come out as this is non-negotiable. It's not the question of when, it's a question of how. And the more people we get on board with that, I think it's going to be really, really helpful. And I can say that everyone on the GC at the CIHR has now read this. And I can't thank, again, the TRC Commission enough, and Justice Sinclair enough for this tool.
Justice, would you like to make any concluding comments for us?
All right, thank you. Yeah, I do actually. I want to first of all acknowledge all of the panelists who have spoken and the the words that they have shared and the experiences that they've talked about. It was very moving to listen to all of you. But before the battery dies on my daughter's phone here, I wanted to respond to Darlene's question about survivor, the word survivor. The word survivor was, at the beginning of our work as commissioners, a very controversial word. We didn't like it. We tried to change it. We went to survivors groups and the survivor committee members who were advising us and said, we'd like to come up with a better word, because the word survivor struck us as being a word that talks about people who are just getting by, people who are barely alive. It's like they're just barely surviving. Almost, that's a phrase that almost comes to mind when you utter the words. And yet, almost to a person, they wouldn't let us change the word. They didn't like us to even raise it with them because they saw themselves as survivors. And unconsciously, they couldn't explain it to us, but unconsciously they felt it was important to keep the label. And they often referred to veterans of the war, you know, that it conjures up its own image for them, and so they felt it was very important. And we consulted others around the world who'd been involved in Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and including people from the South African Commission. And one of the South African Commission members who came to one of our events, and I was talking with him about it, he said, you really should take a look closely at what Nelson Mandela says about surviving. And I had read Mandela's biography. I'd actually read three of his biographies. Two of them were not sanctioned by him, but one that he did write himself, A Long Walk to Freedom. And he, in that book, he actually writes about what it took for him to be able to get through what he did. He actually doesn't use the word survivor, but after I finished reading his biography again, I realized that at a very important level, he is the ultimate survivor. He is the one who represents all that could be thrown at someone, and he came through it strong out of it, and he became the leader of his nation. And in his biography, he refers to a poem that he says he would read every day when he was in prison. He was in prison for 27 years. And he would read the poem because it inspired him to be able to hang on until things would be better. And I just want to read you the poem. And many of you will remember this from your high school days and other times in your life when you were forced to read bad poetry. But this is an excellent poem when you read it in the context of Mandela's life and why and how it kept him alive. He said, the poem reads this, it's a poem called Invictus. And he says, the poem says, out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody, but unbowed. Beyond the place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And so that short poem literally kept him alive and inspired him to keep waiting until the opportunity would present itself where he could do something about what was happening to him. And that's what surviving meant to him. The fact that you do not give up. And the survivors that we spoke to, despite the tremendous amount of pain that they felt, to a person talked about the fact that they knew they should not give up, that there were reasons why this was happening and what they would be able to do about it. And so they often talked about their children, they often talked about their grandchildren and the children yet to come in the future. And when we talk about reconciliation, again, another difficult word to come to terms with. What does reconciliation mean? What importance do we place upon the context of reconciliation? The best definition or the best explanation of reconciliation was from an Ojibwe elder who said, it is about coming to terms with the past in a way that allows you to live in the future. Coming to terms with the past in a way that allows you to live in the future. So at a personal level, reconciliation is about coming to terms with the past. And in his book on reconciliation, Archbishop Desmond Tutu talks about the fact that reconciliation is about forgiveness. But sometimes, he says, the only thing you need to forgive is yourself. Is yourself. You do not have to forgive the one who hurt you. You do not have to forgive the state. You do not have to forgive the army. But sometimes you have to forgive yourself. And survivors, when we would ask them to talk about this term, often talked about the fact that the only forgiveness that was important to them was the forgiveness they wanted from their children, because they were damaged coming out of the schools and unable to provide to their children the kind of life that they had wanted their children and grandchildren to have. And so they wanted to apologize to their children, but they didn't know if it would be received well. And so they hesitated. And yet at the same time, when we talk to intergenerational survivors and they would talk about their anger over how their parents and grandparents were treated, I would say to them, out of that anger that you have, you must remember that the one thing that you can do that is very important is you can talk to your parents and to your grandparents, to your aunties and your uncles, and tell them, now you understand. Now you know why things are the way they are and why you did what you did, and I forgive you. You don't have to ask for an apology, and you shouldn't think that one is needed by you, because what happened to the survivors was not their fault. They were victims of this too, as are you. But from victim to victim, you need to say, I forgive you. And in that way, I said, you will contribute to the healing of your community more than any other thing that you have ever done. And it struck me as well in watching the panel come forward and in seeing the list that had been sent to me ahead of time about who was going to be on the panel, that this was going to be an interesting panel because it was all women. And it wasn't just for the gender issue alone, though. It was for what woman represents in our community. That about 25 years ago, maybe longer now, after the AJI, I was doing a presentation to a conference sponsored by the Gabriel Dumont Institute in Saskatchewan, and I said at that time that based upon what I had seen and heard during the course of the AJI hearings, and based upon what I had read and heard from our elders in the course of ceremony and other teachings, the reason why we have as much of our culture and our language and our way of life as we do is not because of the men, but it's because of the women. It's because of the mothers, because of the grandmothers. They're the ones who kept the family together. They're the ones who ensured that what little they were able to retain, they passed it on to their children. They are and were the first teachers of those children. And whatever the children were able to carry forward into their lives was firstly given to them by their mothers, including that sense of love and that sense of nurturing. And so, because it was the women who gave that to the children, we as a community of Indigenous people need to acknowledge the role that women have played in keeping us alive, in keeping our culture alive, in keeping our families as intact, though damaged, though chaotic and dysfunctional as they might be, but in keeping that strength that we now are able to build upon still here with us. And so in listening to the speakers today, it struck me that they all spoke first as mothers like that, as women like that, as women who carry that sense of responsibility forward. And so I give them credit for that. I think it was a powerful, important message for us to see. And so I want to thank them personally for doing that. And I thank you all for being here to bear witness to it. Miigwech.
In a moment, we'll have a few closing remarks from our host, and I think we'll be closing with a song. But please join me one more time in thanking our panelists and Justice Sinclair for everything they've done for us today. And panelists, be very careful standing up so you don't fall.
Don't stand up yet, please.
Don't stand up yet.
No,
Okay.
sorry. So just a few final thank yous more generally, but I reflected, the idea for this forum began in Ottawa at the end of May during the Congress for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And my wife Sue and I went to the lecture given by Justice Sinclair. This was at the launch, the beginning launch, and it was a fabulous lecture, as you would expect. I would say there were 500 people in the hall that day, and he received a long standing ovation. I don't think I saw a single person in their seat at the end of what was a great talk. We had been thinking about, in the college, thinking about the concept of indigeneity and how we might further conversation around that. And in a sense, those two things came together, and luckily Justice Sinclair and our panelists, of course, were available to make this day happen. Before we go down to a more informal conversation, which I hope you'll all join us in, I do want to thank the staff here at the college. An enormous amount of work has gone into today. In particular, Clark Landine, the assistant principal, Alan Lumbach, who is the program coordinator, and Emily Pfister, who is our communication officer, but all the staff. It has been a tremendous effort to pull this off. For those of you who know this room, by the way, this is our dining hall. Normally there are tables all the way through here, and everything is packed full. There's a ping pong table right here. And so we really wanted to reorganize, of course, for today. I also do want to acknowledge our distinguished guest, the Chancellor Gordon and his wife. It was a pleasure delight to see you attending today, and thank you so much. Of course, Murray Sinclair's wife, Catherine, and their daughter, Gisha. Can I get it wrong every time? And her partner, Amanda. And finally, of course, I want to thank all of you for coming and being part of this, part of what I think has been a really moving but very progressive and positive occasion. Thank you.
We're now very fortunate to be able to close with a song brought to us by our colleagues from the Indian Residential School Survivors Society.
Siam Tanoya, Siam Siai, Yoan Hats and Atlet, Hyakos Wina, the Hayat Chit Lolam, the Hayat Chit Lolam, the Haichka Masi, Chasiam, the Hakahanet, Haichka Masi, Nail to Nestimo. Tar heit squalwen ta eit seet si heit gamasi neil ta schnoe ta chiach ta in chomo. We're in very special times. very sacred times that have been foretold to our ancestors, and that message that they passed on to us in the times that we knew were coming. We're starting to see a little bit of light in the dark times that we have been suffering with. I think my wife is calling. I'd like to say hi to my wife.
Hi, Lorraine. I'm going to ask you to help forgive your husband here. Phone call for the moment. Is that all right? He'll call you back right away.
It's Murray, babe. It's Murray.
Okay, sorry. I think you're in trouble.
Nothing new. Nothing new. The reason I did that is I wanted to share as well with Murray at the inaugural launch of the TRC. You invited my wife to be one of the first speakers when they were to be nationally televised. And my wife has I want you to know how much your support meant to her in getting her through that time. And thanking, your Chewash, your wife, and your family, and thanking you for sharing your loved one with us. Thank you for being so rich in your spirit.
Would you like to invite your colleagues in the society?
Please do, please.
I know there's quite a crew here from the Residential School Survivors Society. Would you come up and join us? We're honored to have you here today.
All life givers. And it's always important to, as my brother here stated, that as a male, as a man, being up front, it's not because I am better or stronger, it is because I am weaker. And the life givers watch over us. So they watch over us from behind, not because they are less, but because they are stronger. They carry the teachings. And so we're very careful. Even though we try our best, we still get in trouble. But that's okay. I always come back for more. So, just one more message. It comes from one of the dearest elders from this territory, our dear late Similano. Some of you may remember him, Vincent Stogan. And he always shared with us, when you walk this way of life, people are going to knock you down. And when you're down, they're going to kick you. But they're going to spit on you too when you walk this way of life. And he said, you know what you have to do? You pick yourself up and you brush yourself off. Because what you're brushing off isn't yours. It's whoever knocked you down and kicked you and spit on you. We don't carry that stuff, and this is what we're learning to do. And then he said, when you start walking again, be ready when those who knocked you down, those who spit on you, those who kicked you, ask you for help. And this is the way that our late ancestor carried himself. He never said no. He is my very first teacher. I'm very blessed to have been in his life. I do my best to our life givers and elders, just to show that I was listening. I thank my big brother. My sister here for asking for the drum. This is a journey song, and my sisters, you should know this song by now. Oh, I just lip sync. So everyone, do come downstairs. The reception just straight downstairs and into the main room. Thank you for coming.